At 38, the silence feels expensive. At 27, he spent money to feel important. At 38, his account shows the truth. At 27, he avoided looking at it. At 38, every bill feels heavier. At 27, he treated bills like suggestions. At 38, the calls don't stop. At 27, he never picked them up. At 38, he counts what's left. At 27, he never counted anything. At 38, stress lives in his chest. At 27, he called it living freely. At 38, everything is on the line. At 27, nothing felt serious. At 38, he sells what he once showed off. At 27, he bought things to impress people. At 38, reality is loud. At 27, he muted it with spending. At 38, he learns the cost of comfort. At 27, comfort was the goal. At 38, sleep doesn't come easy. At 27, he wasted nights without purpose. At 38, he feels trapped. At 27, he built the trap himself. At 38, his lifestyle disappears overnight. At 27, he inflated it every day. At 38, he looks for solutions. At 27, he avoided responsibility. At 38, regret feels real. At 27, mistakes felt harmless. At 38, every decision matters. At 27, decisions were careless. At 38, he wishes he saved something. At 27, he saved nothing. At 38, he faces consequences. At 27, he ignored warnings. At 38, time feels short. At 27, time felt endless. At 38, his confidence is shaken. At 27, he faked confidence with money. At 38, survival becomes the goal. At 27, pleasure was the goal. At 38, he realizes the truth. At 27, he ignored it completely. At 38, rebuilding feels hard. At 27, building felt unnecessary. At 38, he stands alone with his choices. At 27, he made them without thinking. At 38, he becomes a warning. Because bankruptcy at 38 doesn't begin at 38. It begins at 27.